I made a video a few weeks ago on why I still have hope for North America. And a big element I didn't spend a lot of time talking about was how a lot of North American cities already have pretty good bones. And in New York City, that so often looks like the incredible network of subway and railway lines which crisscross the city and connect tons of important neighborhoods and destinations. Now, in many ways, I think the quintessential New York subway line, and possibly my favorite, is the 7 train. So let's talk about how one of the world's best transit lines is located in the United States. The 7 train is simply a great transit line, up there with London's Piccadilly Line, Paris's Line 1, Hong Kong's East Rail Line, and Tokyo's Asakusa Line. It's just a critical part of New York's entire transportation system. So what is the 7 train? Well, it's one of the 7 IRT train services that are part of the New York City subway, that use the narrower train cars on the system. You can learn about the other services as well as the system as a whole in my New York City subway explainer video. The 7 is also a route which cuts across Queens and across Midtown Manhattan, serving as both a useful commuter line from Queens into Midtown Manhattan, but also a useful circumferential or crosstown line within Manhattan itself. The 7 is also really famous for passing through an incredibly diverse part of Queens, with different ethnic enclaves running up and down the line, so much so that it's often dubbed the International Express. And if you want to learn more about that element of the line, I really recommend you go check out the video from Thea of Urban Caffeine on the 7 and the neighborhoods around it. Suffice to say, the 7 connects a lot of interesting places and serves a diverse set of journeys. And since a lot of the buses from LaGuardia Airport end up along the 7 line, it even is many people's first experience of New York City, riding above the streets of Queens. But you probably want to know why it's quintessential, and why it's just such a good transit route. So let's talk about that. Well, for one, it's old. The route that is the 7 train first started up in 1915. And over a century of good transit service means that the parts of the city that the 7 trains travel through are incredibly well built up around the line, which, like most of the subway system in New York City, is a nice mix of elevated and underground tracks, with tunnels across the East River and in Manhattan, as well as in Flushing, and elevated tracks stitching these two tunneled sections together. And we could learn a lot of lessons from this today. Transit lines in urban areas do not need to all be underground. When transit provides a great service, communities will embrace it. And if we were a little more willing to build like the 7 train today, we might have more 7 trains around the world. Of course, being quintessentially New York subway isn't all good, because just 8 of the 22 stations on the 7 train are ADA accessible. But to be fair, that is improving. Even just right now, in the next few months, Queensboro Plaza will be having one of its platforms closed so that it can be made more accessible. And that tends to be the shape of things in New York. Slow, incremental progress. Too slow, but progress nonetheless. Now, like most of the rest of the New York City subway, the 7 train uses big trains, sort of, because they are narrow, but really long. And in this, the 7 train is actually unique internationally. It's really uncommon to have a subway line which uses narrow trains that aren't still fairly short. You see that in places like Paris, Madrid, and London. Instead, the trains on the 7 are a little over 2.5 meters wide and over 170 meters long, with 11 cars, which is long not just for a subway line, but for a suburban rail line in most places. And that was actually made possible by something that New York used to be really good at and now isn't very good at, a cost-effective platform extension program. A much more recent upgrade to the line came in the form of Communications-Based Train Control, or CBTC, which the 7 train was second to get in New York after only the L train, which is also a line that is basically entirely independent from the rest of the subway network and travels across Manhattan. CBTC allows for more reliability and more efficient operations. The train can literally be automatically driven in a more efficient way. But particularly relevant to the 7 train is that CBTC enables more service, so that trains can be measured in seconds apart rather than minutes. And it is truly marvelous to see 7 train after 7 train coming along the line during peak periods. This high frequency of service is a big part of what makes riding the 7 train such a joy, and it's also critical to moving its hundreds of thousands of passengers every single day, more than many entire transit systems. Now, this mix of old line with new infrastructure added on top of it to handle the demand of 2000s New York City is pretty common across the subway system. And even on the 7, this mix of old and new is incredibly visible in the elevated viaducts, some of which are the old steel variety and some of which are concrete. As you would expect for such an old and important line, the 7 also has a ton of useful connections, whether they be to other subway lines, the Long Island Railroad, or just important destinations and neighborhoods in the city. Some of these connections are truly fantastic, and they should be a model for things we build today. For example, Queensboro Plaza is one of my favorite stations in the world, as an elevated cross-platform interchange station between the 7 train and the N and W trains, meaning that you can make seamless journeys from Queens to Lower Manhattan or Brooklyn just by walking across the platform. And despite the connections not being quite as wonderful, there are also useful connections to the G in Long Island City, as well as to tons of other services at Grand Central, where the 7 is really deep underground. I also believe, and you can let me know in the comments down below, that that's one of the first platforms on the New York subway that's set to get platform gates, which is really cool. Of course, you can also connect quite seamlessly to the Long Island Railroad main line at 61st Woodside, and to the Port Washington branch at Met's Willets Point. Of course, at that latter station, you also have Citi Field, where the New York Mets baseball team plays, Corona Park, which I personally really love, as well as the whole World's Fair site, and the National Tennis Center, where you can see the US Open. It's just a corner of Queens that has a lot of stuff in it. I also have to mention that the line provides really good service to the East River waterfront, which is a really nice part of Long Island City that I'm personally quite fond of. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, you have a ton of useful connections. Fifth Avenue, Grand Central, as I mentioned before, and Times Square. It's sort of like the Tourist Express and not just the International Express. There's also the semi-recent extension of the 7 line to Hudson Yards, and what could be more New York than a short, a very expensive, and recently constructed extension on what is otherwise a very old transit line. Like a lot of the outer IRT portion of the subway, the 7 train is almost entirely triple tracked along its middle elevated section through Queens, which is pretty much unheard of on metro systems internationally. What it does enable, though, is the very New York Express services during peak periods and 24-hour service that's actually super respectable, every 15 to 20 minutes, including overnight on a Sunday. Sure, triple track isn't the most efficient way to do express services, but it does mean commuters can wake up a few minutes later to go to work and get home sooner to their families. It also allows for super express services back to the city after a Mets game, which are just the little things that make riding transit that much better than being in a car or taking another mode of transportation. And they're just the type of thing we don't really do anymore. But given the triple track, how do the express services actually work? Well, during peak hours, trains run every 2 to 3 minutes, thanks to CBTC. But to take advantage of the express tracks in the peak direction during peak hours, roughly about 50% of trains operate express and 50% operate local. Since train frequencies are so high overall, again just every 2 to 3 minutes, that means that both the local passengers and the express train passengers get a really good 5-minute service. If you're curious to learn how these train movements work in more detail, at least in the optimal case, the MTA publishes a detailed schedule, and you can use a website like Transseat to get a better sense for the scheduling. You can even whip out a string diagram that's automatically generated. You can learn more about string diagrams in this video. So I hope you can see that the 7, while close to my heart, is also very special. It connects tons of places, has a lot of history, and is also just a great transit line, with great connectivity, excellent service, and uniquely large and narrow trains. Thanks for watching.